Hello there, and welcome to this presentation. I'm going to talk about what could be the coming population collapse for the planet Earth and some ideas on how to survive it. And I hope you enjoy and find this interesting. It's going to take at least 45 minutes. I'm not sure exactly how long. A few caveats and an introduction to myself. That's a picture of me. I am not a statistician or a demographer. I just like math sometimes. I have degrees in engineering, physics, and public policy. I have dabbled in various aspects of some of the issues I'll talk about. I do live in the United States. I like to sail. That's a picture of me on one of the boats I use down in the Chesapeake Bay. And special thanks to our channel sponsor, Windswept Sole. They do nautical t-shirts and clothing. Some really cool designs with boats on them. They have great shirts, and the website's there, windsweptsole.com. I hope you all get a chance to check it out if you do like shirts with boats on them. The United Nations World Population Project has been a part of the UN offices for many years, and they keep track and predict of how many people are on the planet and what some of the implications are. And as recently as November last year, we hit 8 billion people. They are currently predicting steady linear growth for at least 70 more years. And a likely peak per the UN is 10.4 billion people in 2086. But note the uncertainty. They predict several different scenarios, some of which are that the population, the number of births may go down, or that longevity and average age may not be as long. But at least for the next 30 years, they're predicting the population to still go up. Why does population matter? Well, more people is more greenhouse gases and more carbon. I'll show a graph later with the relationship between people and greenhouse gases and global warming and climate change and that stuff. More people need more food, need more farming, more land converted into food production. Today, modern farms, that means also more fertilizer, which comes from oil and gas. So we use more oil and gas to grow all that food. More people also provides more tax revenue for the government. With an ever-increasing revenue stream, the government tends to get bigger and bigger and provide the services. Usually it's roughly proportional to the number of people. More people also means more product demand, so companies will sell more stuff, more houses and more cars. More young people means well-supported old people. When you have Social Security and retirement funds, growing retirement funds and stable retirement income depends on possibly stock markets or Social Security, which needs lots of people to keep feeding that cycle so that the older retirees have a comfortable retirement income. Essentially, more people is more customers for everything. So is more people really good for the economy and good for the planet? We're going to talk about that today, and it may not be the same answer. If you do not keep having a growing population, that ends up what we call population collapse. And that can be pretty scary and bad. There are what's called ghost villages now in Japan, parts of Italy, parts of Spain, where there's nobody living anymore. There are fewer young, healthy people to earn wages and pay taxes. Old retirees are expensive. This is a different problem. They get sick more often. They're retired. They don't work. So when you have fewer young people and more old people, that can be a problem from an economy and as far as the base of the economy that's supporting retirees. And then fewer people is lower demand, especially for housing. With each generation, when you have smaller numbers of people, you can get to a cycle of falling housing prices. And again, I mentioned these ghost villages. You can buy houses in some of these locations now for $10,000, $15,000, or even $1. It's a $1 thing, but you have to commit to go there, fix up the house, and live in the live in the town or live in the village. They're desperate for people in some of these communities. And different parts of the world have seen that at different times. I know we saw that in some of the Midwest towns in the U.S. Back 30 years ago as well, when the housing was just, the prices were just collapsing. Let's define a few basic definitions of things I'm going to talk about so that the rest of the presentation makes more sense. The first is fertility rate. That is the number of babies born per a woman between the age of 15 to 49. So each year you take all the women between 15 to 49, take all the babies, divide those two numbers, and you have a statistical number. It tends to be somewhere around 2, 1 or 2 or 3 or 4. It's essentially family size, but it also incorporates the number of women that are married versus not married into this single statistic. And there is what's called a replacement rate. That fertility rate should be at least 2.1 for the population to remain stable. And the 0.1 accounts for some people that die before they get to be either men or female that die before they get to be adults or during adulthood. And it's a little more than 2 because you got to replace both the mom and the dad, basically. The other statistic is the birth rate. That's the number of babies born in a single year. That's usually counted per 1,000 or 10,000 or so in the population. That's important, but it's we end up comparing that to the essentially the death rate, and you look at whether more people are being born than there are dying, and then that means you have a growing population. The last factor that's important to consider is called the dependency ratio, and that is the number of old people, and I'm counting that as 66 and over, per 100 workers aged between 18 and 65. So it's basically the ratio of retirees per 100 working age people. The working age people make the economy run. The retirees do not. Basically, the retirees are expensive. The working people are creating product and contributing to the economy and the incomes. Some countries actually have money saved for retirees. Others count on tax revenue from current workers. Depends on which country and which retirement system they're in. So this dependency ratio, it would be nice if we have lots of working people and not too many retirees, but that doesn't last forever because essentially the working people eventually get older and then they're retired. So if you have good health care and don't have massive pandemic losses, deaths, and things are going well, the problem with populations is that they get older, and so you can't keep something, it's very hard to keep something stable as far as these numbers go. But we'll look at what some different countries have as far as this dependency ratio over and over in this talk and compare what the implications are. So let's look at the UN data, and they make their predictions based on a few key assumptions. The first is that the data they get from the countries is accurate. Most of the data they do not create themselves. They don't go out and count people. They collect that data from countries. The second assumption that the fertility rate, even though it's been going down at a certain rate for the last 70 years, is now going to go down at a slower rate, and roughly 1/6 of the old rate as far as the rate of decline. And that is very much based on what happens in Africa, which their data shows is going to go down slowly, but only it's going to take about 50 years, from 5 now to about 1.6. So these are some key assumptions. We're going to talk about the implications, but let's take a bit of a tour around the world and look into what the UN numbers mean for each part of the world. In Europe, there's been a declining population for several decades. The UN data assumes that the birth rate, though, will increase. It will not go down as much. It's currently at about 1.5, and the UN data shows it going back up to about 1.6, slowly over time. Even despite having slightly more babies per family, the rate of decline in the population overall continues, with fewer and fewer children over the next 50 years or so, and that means fewer and fewer workers. However, all the people that are currently working, this big peak here, will age and get older, so we have a lot more retirees in the future. The result of that is more retirees, fewer workers, and an overall falling population, which generally speaking is going to be a fair economic disaster overall, unless solutions are adjusted and economic policies and government policies to make things better. Not quite Europe, but next to Europe there is Russia. They have a similar problem with a declining population. Even when they assume a rising birth rate, which is what they're projecting, it'll go from 1.5 up to 1.6 also. And this data was before the Ukraine war started, and took over 1 million men out of the country's population group, and crashed the economy in Russia as far as creating negative economic conditions for starting families. But even with this slightly higher birth rate, the population is projected to fall 25%, over 30 million people by 2100, from about 140 million or so down to 110 million. However, in a more worst case situation, if the fertility rate actually stays at a lower level or falls further, they could be looking at a population of less than 70 million people, roughly half the size of the country, in 30 to 50 years. To make matters worse, unfortunately, also of the people they are going to have, a lot more of them will be older, and they're looking at a retiree to working group ratio that'll go up from approximately 20 or so up into 40 or 50, and possibly as high as 70 or higher over the next 50 years. 22 to 45 retirees per 100 workers in the predicted scenario, but it could be much worse, triple or more in a worst case scenario. Meanwhile, back in the USA, there's a similar story. The UN and the US population data says that the fertility ratio here will stop falling and stabilize this year and be flat for the next 70 years, which will slowly lead to a slowly growing population with continued stable immigration from about 340 million people to 400 million people by 2100. Even with this seemingly optimistic scenario, the dependency ratio will grow from 40 to 60 retirees per 100 workers. If the fertility ratio falls down to around 1 versus 1.5, the dependency ratio could get up to 75 or 80 or 90 retirees per 100 workers. And the escape valve in the U.S. is immigration, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Switching to South America, if we look at all the countries in South America, the story is all about Brazil. Overall in South America, the fertility ratio is predicted to slowly decline down and stay around 1.75. With that happening, the population peaks in about 20 years, and it's all due to Brazil. If we look at the countries involved in the growth rate from 2022 to 2045, Brazil is the one that's adding another 25 million people, whereas every other country is just adding a very small number, maybe less than 1 million person per several of the countries. At that point, after 25 years, the South American population also starts to decline. However, their dependency ratio, retirees per 100 workers, only goes up from about 20 to 40 in the next 35 years. And if the fertility ratio is 1.1, the dependency ratio gets as high as 50. But overall, that's not too bad compared to some of the other industrialized, the Western countries or Europe or America, where it's getting up from between 50 and 100. If the fertility ratio is lower, essentially the population of South America drops by half, from 400 million to 200 million over the next 70 years or so. Not quite as bad of a story, and they have still some good years as far as growth goes, again dominated by Brazil. Hopping over to Australia, the UN predicts the fertility ratio there will roughly stay the same, will not go down, will not go up, which would be mathematically really interesting for the next 75 years. And if that's true, the dependency ratio, the result again of a stabilizing population, slightly aging, total population going up, they end up with the dependency ratio moving from about 60 or 70, or roughly 35 to 60 or 70 workers per retirees over the next 70 years. The lucky thing for Australia is historically they do attract some immigration. The unlucky thing is that that part of the world Australia is rapidly warming with climate change, and conditions are getting much more difficult there. We've seen with the wildfires and coral reef problems happening down there. But they have maybe a little more room to work with as far as economic levers than some countries, and again benefited by immigration. So let's talk about Asia, because in Asia, it's a population in transition. We just had the news last week about China stopped growing and started contracting and shrinking a little bit. The UN predicts that the declining fertility ratio there slows. Despite 4 years of going down, that now it's not going to go down as fast, and it will stay above 1.5 for the next 70 years. It also shows that the old age group there population will increase from roughly 500 million to 1.5 billion people over 65. And this increase is baked in. There's all those people already are alive basically, and they're going to get older. And that number is going to go up and up and up. And assuming this slightly slowed birth rate and the growing old age population, the UN says the Asian population will rise from about 4.5 billion to 5.2 billion and peak in 2055. And that's dominated by a few countries. So let's see who. Note that in Asia, though, by tradition or law, in some cases, the family must take care of their elderly, including the health bills, and in some countries there's pensions that give you maybe enough money to buy some food, but it's a family responsibility. And this has a significant impact on the marriage rates, because a couple that gets married, starts planning a family, has to plan for the fact that besides maybe themselves and 2 children or 1 children, they have to take care of 4 parents. So that's 8 mouths to feed, and for maybe 20 years or so while their parents are alive and retired. And that high cost and the scariness of it, or the responsibility for it, is leading to smaller families. Even with the predicted fertility ratio of 1.6, though, the ratio of retirees to 100 workers in Asia will rise from 15 to 50 in the next 5 decades. And again, this is also mostly baked in. No way to avoid it, unless there was a large population drop or rise as far as young people or old people. So within Asia, Japan is the case study for aging populations. Japan has seen this problem for several decades. Already they are the canary in the mine shaft as far as looking at what happens, and they are the experiment lab as far as looking at what's possible. The UN prediction for the fertility ratio there in Japan is that it will increase slightly from 1.2 to 1.5. This seems dubious. Japan has been trying to raise the family support and motivate families to have babies, but generally speaking, young people are not buying it and have not started creating more children as far as family size goes. With this going on, the population is still continuing to decline though, and peaked about 12, 13 years ago, and will continue to shrink to be roughly half the size in the next 60 years with these numbers. And this is assuming the fertility ratio stabilizes. If it continues to decline, the country gets even smaller. But even with the small country, they have the worst problem, that the dependency ratio, it's already bad at 55 retirees per 100 workers, but it will get up to about 80 retirees per 100 workers if the fertility ratio rises. If the fertility ratio falls, they could end up with over 100 retirees per 100 workers, roughly the same number of retirees in that 20-year age bracket as there are workers in a 40-year age bracket. And that's a very difficult proposition as far as trying to manage an economy. What Japan has done to try and mitigate this problem so far is that they have a lot of older people are working, often out of necessity because they don't have the pension support and they're trying to survive. They've also had a lot of automation as far as robotics. Let's talk about China. China has a declining birth rate that's had a big impact. Most people are familiar with what's called the one-child policy that was put in place in 1980. The government at that point was looking at a scary proposition of large amounts of famine. They couldn't feed people, so they said, okay, that's it. Everyone, let's help the country out, help the motherland, don't have any more than one child. And it did help make the country wealthy and help make the country more able to feed its population within that time frame, the last 50 years. But it has led to a pending population crash because in China, the fertility rate has gone down to 1.16. And the data they predict is that it will stop going down this year and will slowly rise back up to 1.4 in the next 15 years and then stay at 1.4. Magically flat as far as curve goes. In China, this will have a big future impact. The one-child policy doomed future growth, and 20 years later, there were fewer children, meant fewer adults. Fewer adults was fewer consumers and fewer workers, and eventually will mean a lower gross domestic product or a lower size of the economy. Also a lower demand for energy, food, and housing in the long run as the population starts to get smaller. And that, the mean case, the prediction, maybe somewhat optimistic, is that this solid red line as it goes down. The worst case scenario is that the number of birth rate could go even further down, to fall again by half over the next, or more, 80% in the next 50 years. So when we look at the retiree per worker ratio again, the total population declines from 1.4 billion to 750 million over the next 50 years or so. But out of that 750, over 300 million are over 65 and retired. So the future, they will go from 20 retirees per 100 workers today to roughly 100 retirees per 100 workers in 2080. And going up to 50 per 100 by 2050 is already baked in as well. The question is whether or not it gets much worse or just kind of worse and stabilizes at 50 or so workers per, retirees per worker in the long run. Unfortunately, in China, there are a lot of trends that are saying this could actually get much worse, though. They have a young people today in China have a philosophy called "let it rot," which means they're not buying into the philosophy of go to work hard, succeed, have families, have children, be happy. They're not optimistic on the economy, so they're just doing the minimum, and they don't view a future. They don't think they have a future as far as buying houses and having families. So that UN data that assumes China fertility ratio goes up and stabilizes at 1.3 or 1.4 from 1.18 now, that's actually China's government plan and their belief of what will happen because of the controlled economy policies they're putting in place. Given that optimistic fertility ratio, the population of young people slowly goes down over 80 years. And that leads to a gradual decline in total population. But a continued decline in fertility ratio, the worst case numbers could actually be 140 or more workers, retirees per 100 workers. So you'd have 50% more retirees than you have workers even. And out of 700 million people in 2100, they could be looking at over 400 million of them being retirees and roughly 300 million being workers or teenagers and children, which is even a small number. So you have maybe 250 million workers supporting 400 million retirees. There's no economic model for that. Even Japan today is not even close to this level of problem, and it's not clear what they can do to try to change that given their current economic and government policies. It's a coming train crash. The latest China data that just came out actually confirms this worst case scenario. It came out 2 weeks ago. The population suddenly, or finally at this point, started to decrease. Almost 1 million fewer people in 2022 than they had in 2023. About 9.5 million births and 10.5 million deaths. So they had more deaths than births, and the growth rate was a negative 0.6 per thousand. It actually shrank as far as population growth rate. They have almost 32 extra men versus female in the country within the population now. And the share of urban population is 920 million people. Life expectancy of 77 for now. But that 10 million births per year, if we divide that, we end up, at one point they had about 16 million births per year. Now they have about 10 million births per year. And if you look at the population of where it is, 20% of their population is already over 60, and 18% is under 16. So almost half the population in China is either young or old and not contributing to the economic growth as far as productivity goes. So the canary in the coal mine is singing a lot louder now over in China. They are trying to change the fertility ratio in China. If we look at kind of gameplay the numbers here and look at what's happening, if they're roughly 10 million a year, we're having babies now. They had about 10.5 million births last year and 9.5 million this year. The changing fertility ratio from 1.16 to 1.4, that would take another 2.5 million babies a year, roughly a 25% increase. And assuming the population's stable and no more people get married, that is roughly 1/4 of the married couples having additional babies every year. And if it ever happens, it really will not happen fast, unfortunately. The thing about mathematics and large numbers is that the trends tend to be really hard to change, and getting over 2 million families in China to suddenly have another baby in the next year or every year, it's nearly impossible. Looking at other countries in the region, the big story now is India. The UN data and India's data says that India's falling fertility ratio will stabilize at 1.6. Despite a 70-year decline going down and down, it will now slowly roll off and not fall as fast. With that, India did surpass China this year as now being the biggest country in the world, or they will, and we're going to rise up to 1.7 billion in the next 30 years. And then again, this year becoming the largest country. And with those numbers, their age dependency ratio grows from 15 up to 60 retirees per 100 workers. However, if the fertility ratio continues to go down further and not level off as much, the net result is they'll have fewer people in the future, but they'll have a lot more retirees versus workers, and that dependency ratio goes up to about 80 or so retirees per 100 workers. Not quite as bad as China, but still quite bad. The big story about population in the future actually is, in the long run, is not India, but it's Africa. Africa has a growing population, and the UN predictions are that the fertility ratio there will not go down below 2 for another 70 years. Because of that, the UN predicts the population will roughly triple by 2100. And this actually dominates the world's future population growth. The way we get from 8 billion to 10.4 billion is adding 3 billion people in Africa and 500 million fewer people around the rest of the planet. That growth in Africa is actually mostly driven by 5 countries: Nigeria, Ethiopia, the Congo, Egypt, and Tanzania. And if we look at historical trends, economic education and modernization and wealth in those 5 countries could have a huge impact on what actually happens with those numbers. Africa's age dependency ratio actually is not too bad compared to other countries. With the current numbers, because they're having a lot more children, a lot growing population, it's going to rise from about 4 retirees per 100 workers up to about 20 retirees per 100 workers. And it only goes up to about 35 if their fertility ratio were to crash a lot earlier or fall a lot earlier, and their growth rate would not be as high in the population and the young people. So Africa has a huge advantage demographically as far as supporting its elderly population and retirees based for the next 75 years. It's a big strength. But Africa only it will add about 2.5 billion people to the Earth's population if nothing changes. It is the only continent with a growing population. It's the only region that still has a substantially high fertility ratio. It biases the world numbers. Faster urbanization in Africa would, if historical trends are consistent, would allow more women to have careers, and that would raise the family income and lower birth rates. It would increase the total family wealth because children are expensive, and when women work, they make money, and provide a substantial improvement in the quality of living for the families in these countries, in all of Africa. Education and urbanization and an end in some areas to a child bride culture would tend to lower the fertility ratio, though, as well as raise the family wealth. And the UN data assumes that this will slowly happen over 70 years if nothing else changes. But if we look at the curves here, Africa's fertility ratio being up here at 4 3 and 4 for the next 40 years, it's what's keeping the world fertility ratio average higher, as high as it is. When we look at worldwide trends, the mean fertility ratio stabilization that the UN's predicting here is really based on that Africa fertility ratio staying at 3 or 4 for the next 30 or 40 years. The UN number shows it slowly falling from 2.3 down to 1.6, and again, it's being held up by Africa, and that's why it doesn't continue down the same type slope. If that ratio were to hit 1.6 faster, we would actually achieve a peak population of about 8.4 billion in 2050. And again, that's still driven by Africa and India. If it goes down to 1.1 faster, we are already at peak population and could be heading down to a smaller world of 7 billion people by 2060. But if that happens, even with that, or if that happens, the dependency ratio, it's already going to be 50% worse in 25 years. That's baked in. But if it goes down, if the fertility ratio goes down to 1.1, that dependency ratio gets another 10-point worse. Roughly 40 retirees per 100 workers. And in some countries, it's 100 retirees per 100 workers. Over the long run, that ratio eventually stabilizes at about 50 retirees per 100 workers, if you start to game out the math. And if the population stabilizes as well. Talk a little bit more about global warming. 37% of the world's population lives within 60 miles of an ocean coast. And 10%, almost a billion people, live in areas where it's less than 10 meters above sea level. If the sea levels do rise, I'm not saying they will, but if they do, it will cause the greatest mass migration of people in the history of the planet. Roughly 1 billion people would need to move over several decades, or maybe over a century, maybe just a few decades. And in particular, the island-type countries and the low areas close to rivers, river valleys, they would be the hardest hit. Several countries are in good shape as potential receivers of people, though, in particular Europe and China. China has apparently 70 million empty condominiums waiting for people. Japan, Australia, and North and South America all have the ability to absorb, to collectively could easily absorb 1 billion people into those countries. As long as the immigration policies allow it. And as long as people are motivated to go there. Currently, though, net migration, more people coming in than leaving, really only happens in North America and Europe, the collective West, with its economic growth and generally liberal politics. The U.S. limit for population today is about 700,000 legal immigrants per year. There was another over 2.5 million that entered illegally last year. Without the immigrant population coming in, though, the U.S. would be shrinking. We currently have, if you look at the up here in the top right, the blue curve shows the number of births minus the number of deaths. And the green is 0, the green dash line. So we currently have more people dying than being born as far as native population grows. And it's only this red line, the immigration number, which is keeping the U.S. from growing and keeping the U.S. from facing some of the same problems with ghost towns and shortages of workers and declining growth, economic growth. Canada also has immigration, allows about 450,000 to enter each year, but also has about 200,000 leave each year. Canada's policy, they allow anyone to immigrate after staying there and doing 4 years of college. It's one of the progressive policies. Europe allows immigration as well. Lower left here, they've had roughly 2 million deaths a year collectively in Europe versus births, but they have 1 million immigrants coming in a year. And so their decline has not been as strong as it could be without immigration. They use a system of work permits there as well to allow people to move back and forth more easily, but still retain citizenship of their prior country. They allow about 1 million people a year coming in. Asia and Africa now essentially have no immigration. If you look at the red line, it's right on around zero for both regions of the world. But Africa still has a lot more births than deaths going on, and it will slowly come down, but it's a great big positive number here. But in Asia, they're starting to see now, they only have another 25 years of growth of population before they also see more deaths than births. And if no one else is immigrating there, Asia population overall will start to go down, starting 25 years from now, and that assumes these optimistic fertility ratios are keeping them from growing smaller tomorrow. There have been some very interesting studies that try to relate the population growth to the amount of carbon being put into the planet's atmosphere. Essentially, more people is a warmer planet per most of the studies. And if we look at the red line here, A2, that was the UN population prediction. And B2 is the prediction. A2 was the old prediction back in 2012. B2 is the current prediction here, this purple line. B1 is a 2040 peak population of 8.5 billion. That's this green line here. It's rolling off and going down. So assuming population goes down, the carbon emissions numbers, which are the dashed lines, we used to think it was people was going up, carbon would go up. But if the population rolls over, we actually end up with this blue dashed line where carbon emissions peaks at around 2060 or 2070, and then that starts to go down too. The good thing about having lots of retirees is that they tend not to drive to work every day. They don't drive to soccer games. They don't do as much shopping. We won't say what they are doing, but they don't use as much hydrocarbons and create as much pollution. They don't buy as much stuff. They don't buy new clothes very often. And so that living on a pension tends to limit the budget. And there's a much lower carbon footprint for retirees, which could have an even more stark impact on this. The amount of modeling that happens on this is not particularly good. These prior curves were based on the fact that we had population growing and we had a lot of young people, not on the fact that we had population falling and we had a majority older people. So the curves could be even better than this, and this is potentially some good news coming out of a falling population. Some people, some billionaires have said this is a disaster, but it's not all a bad news story, actually, if you look at what could happen with fewer people on the planet. So if these curves seem somewhat suspicious and questionable on population growth, why do the governments putting these curves together keep on showing a growing population? And there's some reasons for that. These are my opinions as far as what's going on here. Well, one is that, well, we always had a growing population growth. Why would that change? There's a group think. It's hard to look at a totally different scenario when you've been doing something the same way for 20, 30, 40 years within your office predicting more people. Another reason might be, well, the government 5-year plan says we have to have more people, so that's what we're going to do. We will succeed. We're optimistic. We're going to have more people because that's going to make our plan. That's what our plan says to do. Another reason might be more people is more demand. It's rising prices and rising incomes, and that'll make the economy healthier. So let's predict that. Let's assume that's going to happen because it always has happened. So it's a great assumption. Growing population is a growing economy, growing GDP. We need a growing GDP for our country to be successful. So we're going to assume there's more people in the future. And because we have a growing GDP, we have more tax revenue, and that will enable us to pay the national debt. And the opposite is quite scary. If we have a falling population, that means a declining tax base, and the amount of national debt per worker, that load starts to get quite high. And that means you have to make hard choices. In politics, that's really difficult, often unpopular. So you can avoid that if you just assume that the population will keep growing. And that's a very simplistic and maybe not totally correct, but that's what it seems like maybe is happening here as far as all these governments predicting that they're going to have more people. What else could we do in a future smaller world? Uh, well, some ways to survive this, if the curves are actually more pessimistic, as I think they are within these numbers, you have to find a way to remove unproductive economic cost as much as possible. It's not a question, you don't have the demand, you don't have the growth, so now you have to cut cost in your economy. There are some ways to do that. One way is a smaller government. You can have audit-based regulations versus 100% review. You can have more efficient financial markets, maybe less greed-driven profiteering, not as many leveraged buyouts where people are taking loans to buy companies and then having the company cut costs to pay back the loan. That's not very productive economically. More robotics. That's been the Japanese solution for the last few decades. That seems to be the trend. It'll be continuing. For economic efficiency to be better, maybe not having as much war and having more peace. Maybe a smaller military could be possible then. Generally speaking, the military defense part of the economy is not it's not building, not repairing homes. It's not taking care of the elderly in retirement homes, and it's not allowing supporting families to have children. Less construction, and by the way, with fewer people, we won't need that much anymore anyway. So maybe that might be a built-in thing driven by the markets. Less waste in public projects, maybe not having as many bullet trains to small towns like what China's starting to build right now. They have over 30 bullet trains across the country. Maybe fewer and simpler electric cars. Car sharing seems to be a great model. The number of parts that move in an electric car is something like 30 versus apparently over 1,000 or something for the internal combustion engine. So it's a simpler device, it's less maintenance, it could last longer. We could realistically price the cost of carbon and climate change and encourage people to migrate to areas where where there'll be a lower long-term cost as far as paying for the insurance of storms and such. One thing, debt reduction now to reduce taxes in the long term. If you have fewer and fewer people, that smaller number of people cannot pay for a growing debt burden driven by deficit spending. The current population probably should bear the current debts. One way to do that is estate taxes. Apparently there's the national debt in the U.S. is about $30 trillion right now, and apparently the baby boomer generation has about $70 trillion worth of debt. So some of that could be used to pay down the debts that were incurred supporting that generation for the last 30 years. But the long-term debt is not very fair when you don't have as many people in the future, because the debt load per person grows with each generation. More efficient education might be possible. Maybe we have bachelor's degrees in medicine and law instead of having secondary degrees. Reduce the healthcare and legal system costs that way. Maybe more computerized education, more video learning. We've learned a lot about that in the pandemic now. So these are ways to improve the living standard of a country with a flatter declining population. Basically, you need the rate of productivity growth to be positive or substantially positive. These are the references. Anyone can freeze the pane, look up, copy this over. Sorry, it's not clickable. A bunch of organizations are creating some of these charts and talking about these issues. putting together position papers. Again, thank you to the sponsor for this lecture, Windswept Soul Clothing. A bunch of great shirts if you like boats. And a few concluding thoughts. So the UN says peak population will be 10.4 billion in 2086. If the real fertility rates are lower, we are probably already at peak population or near to it. 8 billion, maybe we'll get to 8.5 billion people. In the future, we could be looking at modern economies that need to survive with 100 retirees per 100 workers. There's no model for that now, and that's going to be a big challenge. Some regions of the world, i.e. the West, basically allow immigration in order to sustain their economic growth and prosperity and power. It's not necessarily fair, but it is an advantage for certain areas, and other parts of the world might need to adjust their policies in order to stop the loss of people that are leaving and stabilize their wealth and their population size. And from what I can tell, it's not a disaster if the wealth per capita goes up. With a smaller population, if the country has so much resources and so much money within the country, the national treasury, and you have fewer people, the wealth per capita actually goes up in a smaller population. Unfortunately, if you have a lot of debt within the country as well, the debt per person ratio also goes up. So if you can slowly, maybe not slowly, but over the next 25 years or so, bring down the debt, the declining population of a country could make most of the people in that country slowly get richer, in effect. However, there's this long-term challenge of you can't just have a falling population forever and go down from 7 billion to 3 billion to 2 billion to 1 billion. We could have a big empty world out there, and specialization that allows us now to make cell phones in some places, and other people to be musicians, and other people to be forest rangers or farmers. We could be looking at more of a feudal world where everyone has to make their own products again. That could be a horrible thing. So these are challenges. And lastly, the Africa modernization. If they modernize faster, the predicted numbers could go away. You may not have that 2 billion impact, and we could get to a 7 billion sized world, maybe just in the next 15 to 25 years. And down to 4 billion by 2100 from 7 billion. We'd have half as many people in 75 years from now. Not necessarily a bad thing. We were at 4 billion back at 1980, and the world was doing fine. So these are things that could happen if investment in the world, people pay attention to policies and diplomacy and foreign investment practices, to try and encourage and control that rate, could have a great impact on global warming. Challenges for the future. I did just mention a few of these. The national debt ratio per workers, that could get really bad. That could imply higher taxes are needed. A lot of this is baked in now, but no one wants to show it. We probably need a new approach for both long-term taxes, estate taxes, and retiree support. Global warming impact will be paid for by a smaller population. Maybe all that inherited wealth gets literally just washed away with all those houses on the beach. But there's going to be a lot of cost of rebuilding cities at higher elevations, and you may not have as many people to pay for it all. Of course, it may not be as many people that need to move either. It's not all bad. Housing costs should go down. Capital item cost may decrease also. And the changing population growth of Africa could make its families much more wealthy and reduce carbon emissions to boot worldwide. A world with dependency ratio, 50 retirees per 100 workers, different world than we had for the last 200 years. The retirees may need to work part-time. Social Security model, really not tenable, but neither is the family responsibility model, so we may need a new model. And the world population was fine in 1900, and in 1800, and 1700. We just need to adapt to having a smaller world. And with that, I'll let you all listen to the children's choir in the background for another minute. And thank you all for your attention, and appreciate your interest. If you have any comments, please post them down below. I may not be able to respond to them if there's a lot of them. I look forward to feedback, and hopefully some other scholars in the world can either come up with better solutions, maybe validate what's going on with these numbers, and hopefully the demographic offices start to pay a little more attention to this, because we really are reaching a tipping point as far as how some of these curves are going to go, and there are real costs involved. Thank you again.